I'm Kara Sarah with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. I'm joined by CJ Reynolds, also with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. And this is our first chapter workshop for the Regional Resiliency Action Plan, Chapter 1, which is talking about essentially climate change and climate change indicators. And advance, please. Okay. So the objectives of this meeting are to define terminology around climate change, create a common understanding of climate change indicators, stressors, non-climate stressors, their impacts on hazards. We're also going to identify available data sources for tracking climate indicators from our regional science partners and identify opportunities to improve on the data that we have for implementation by practitioners. And then finally, we're going to draft some goals and objectives related to regionally consistent data use, improving how data is shared and communicated, and how data can be improved to encourage implementation. So this is the schedule for today, starting now with the welcome and introductions. Then we'll talk about the purpose of the chapter. We have some partners with us today and MPC members who are going to help us define hazards, stressors, and drivers. And then we'll talk a little bit about regional trend and projection data. We'll take a brief break at 10:15 and then come back and do some discussion breakout groups related to developing the goals, objectives, and actions for this chapter. We'll do a brief report out on those goals, objectives, and actions, and then continue to work on those actions and have a little bit of a discussion about how we measure success for this chapter before we rejoin the main room and talk about the next steps for the Regional Action Plan process, as well as this chapter process. So we have some sort of guest speakers today. Maya Burke with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program will be helping facilitate the meeting as well as doing presentations. She is a member of the Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition's MPC, as well as Libby Carnahan, who is also a member of the Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition's MPC and a Florida Sea Grant agent at the UF IFAS Extension in Pinellas County. We're also joined by Chris Zambito with Atkins, and Atkins is a Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition partner. So just a sort of overview and reminder of where we started with the Regional Resiliency Action Plan, which was in the Memorandum of Understanding signed by the Regional Resiliency Coalition members. And that Memorandum of Understanding called for the development of a Regional Resiliency Action Plan that included strategies for coordinated regional preparation for adaptation to a changing global environment. And it should be based on mapping of projected sea level rise and the amplification of local impacts of hurricanes and tropical storms. The MOU also called for those strategies and actions to be based on sound science and technical data, and for the coalition members to identify experts for guidance. The MOU encouraged the use of regional recognized sea level rise projections that are produced by the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel. And since the development of the MOU, we've had a couple of workshops and meetings with the Management Planning Committee and the Regional Summit, which I can't believe was this year. And we've further developed the purpose and scope of the Regional Action Plan. So a further definition of the purpose is to create a positive aspirational vision for resilient communities, coastal and inland, urban, suburban, and rural. At those scales, consider federal and state planning requirements, define best practices, national metrics, and certification programs. It should include a scorecard, and it should address equity issues through the entire document. The scope of the plan is to define goals, objectives, and actions for local and regional implementation to support alignment on critical issues. We want to develop actionable strategies for the next 5 years. and prioritize goals and actions to facilitate forward progress through making sure that those goals are high level to ensure widespread acceptance, including a strong focus on risk reduction and adaptation and integrating mitigation and sustainability. I also wanted to point out here that prior to the development of the regional action plan process starting, we had some work groups that fed into some of these prioritizations and actions. And those work groups are being asked to participate through the Regional Resiliency Action Plan chapter workshops. And they will most likely be assigned roles in the goals and objectives that are developed. And that's how we'll continue that work after the Regional Resiliency Action Plan is adopted in next fall. So this is the chapter process. This is the first workshop chapter, first chapter workshop that we're gonna embark on. And in this chapter, we'll be clarifying climate change terms, identifying data sources, data needs, and beginning to develop goals and actions. In the next few chapters, we'll be talking about how those climate change phenomena are impacting public health, habitats, ecosystems, affordable housing, critical infrastructure, and the economy. And chapter 2 will also help to identify the socioeconomic stressors. So we will be covering those things as well. We'll just be thinking about them more in the chapters, the chapter workshops that follow. Because of the nature of this chapter being data heavy and addressing data needs, we'll most likely need to revisit this chapter in the future. As we go through the chapters 2 through 5, we'll probably identify other data needs that we need to address in this chapter. So we expect to have to revisit this chapter after the other chapter workshops. So the purpose of this first chapter. We want to clarify the relevant terminology. So we want to make sure that everybody is on the same page about what a climate change indicator is, a driver, a stressor, and so on. We also want to establish the framework for how to consider climate change and how it impacts our key resources and assets. We also want to summarize the relevant climate change trends and projections where they're available, as well as set goals related to improving how we track climate change indicators and encourage regional consistency on data use and communication. And this is just a neat little graphic kind of following on the purpose of the chapter, which is to think about how the climate change stressors make it so that if we're conducting business as usual, we won't achieve our goals. So we have to adapt based on the stressors and thinking about how much risk is being put on our key assets and resources and systems, and adapt so that when we are conducting our business, we're not conducting it as usual anymore. We're adapting so that we can achieve our goals. So the contents of the chapter, it will include a brief summary of the observed trends and modeled projections related to climate change. Here are a few examples of that. So sea level is trending upwards, and we have projections related to that that show it will increase. The extreme heat days are trending upwards and projected to increase. And precipitation is trending upwards, but right now the projections are unclear. So that would be one of the data needs that we might identify in the chapter. And then continuing the chapter contents, it will include an overview of how we think about the risk and prioritize actions that help us mitigate the greatest risks. And it will reference outside documents instead of trying to be comprehensive. It will sort of summarize what is already existing out there. So some of the documents that it will reference are the CSAP 2019 Sea Level Rise Recommendations, the Tampa Bay Estuary Program's Vulnerability Assessment, the 4th National Climate Assessment, and the DHS Vulnerability Assessment. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about the hazards. We've talked about it in the previous workshop discussions, the table of contents workshop, and the management planning committee that we had in September. We've gotten some feedback about what hazards we consider potentially getting worse because of the climate change stressors. And this is the hazard list that we're kind of presenting here. It's a combination of the statewide hazard mitigation program's hazard list, as well as some hazards that were identified in previous discussions as being important and weren't necessarily on that list. So it aligns well with a lot of the local mitigation strategy plans that were updated recently. Flood, tropical cyclones, severe storm, drought, extreme heat, and geological sinkholes are hazards that are identified in the statewide hazard mitigation plan and align with several of the local mitigation strategies. Algal blooms was identified as being important and was added to this list because of the importance that was given to it in previous workshops. And it is an identified hazard for the Pinellas County local mitigation strategy. Biological incidents were also added because of the importance of thinking about heat-related illness as well as disease outbreaks. So we wanted to also clarify some terminology here. Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm not. So there was a lot of discussion about what is a climate stressor and what is a non-climate stressor at the last workshop. So here's a definition, and this is from climate.gov's resiliency toolkit. So a climate stressor is defined as a condition, event, or trend related to climate variability and change that can exacerbate hazards. So it could be increased air and water temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, rising sea levels. Those are all climate stressors. And non-climate stressors, that's defined as a change or trend unrelated to climate that can exacerbate hazards. So altering drainage patterns and replacing open land with roads and buildings. Those are non-climate stressors for flooding hazards. Population growth is also a non-climate stressor where that growth is happening in an exposed coastal area. So this is sort of a proposed list of non-climate stressors. It helps us to sort of bridge the gap between this chapter and the next chapter, but it's also important for us to acknowledge that there are non-climate stressors, not to just only talk about the climate stressors sort of in a vacuum. So land use change, population growth, socioeconomic vulnerabilities, nutrient pollution, and land development were the ones that I identified based sort of on the discussions that I've heard previously from the last workshop. But I did want to get feedback here on whether or not, based on the definition of the non-climate stressor, people wanted to see something added here to this list. And while I open it up for discussion, I'm also going to look at the chat.
Kara, could you restate the question for the group?
Yes, this is a list of non-climate stressors. Non-climate stressors are, again, defined as sort of situations that make the hazards that we've identified previously worse, that aren't necessarily related to climate. So what's on the list now? Land use change, population growth, existing socioeconomic vulnerabilities, nutrient pollution, and land development.
So would there be things like energy consumption would go in this? Is that tied to building change? I don't know how granular you want to get with these categories. So like transportation factor.
So
Right, so would we discuss, transportation as part of population growth, or would it be its standalone? Like transportation in itself isn't really a stressor.
It is, because you could have a high density and good mass transit and have reduced transportation emissions. So that's a factor of,
so the stressors are making the hazards worse directly.
right.
So we would just need to define, how does transportation.
We'll talk about that sort of thing when we talk about climate drivers. If we keep going through and just kind of help clarify people's thinking, perhaps they can weigh in the chat as we go along, but we haven't sort of got through everything. And so people are still probably mixing. But the idea is these are things that maybe aren't necessarily related to climate change processes, but they are still, part of human impact on the world.
Yeah, this is Whit, and I just want to say our working list of shocks and stressors for our resilience plan in the city of Tampa definitely includes transportation, affordable housing, economic inequalities. These are all things that we believe are non-climate stressors.
Thanks, CJ. And so we'll move on and continue to define terminology so that you guys have all the terminology you need to give feedback. So I'm going to be turning it over now to Maya to talk about the climate stressors.
Yeah, and I think that, part of the reason we're doing this little clarifying terminology exercise is because climate change is a wicked problem. It touches so very many things that we do. And even some of like the simple climate phenomena, when they interact with other physical processes, you can create feedback loops and there's all these other things. So it's very easy to get confused in your thinking pretty quickly. And so we're trying to help give some clarifying frameworks, and, we're probably not 100% there yet, but we hope that this helps. So some examples of climate stressors that we might be interested in paying attention to would be things like increased air temperatures. That means things like hotter nights, more consecutive days of 95-degree or higher temperatures, extreme heat index values, increased water temperature. So warmer water will expand. It helps contribute to sea level rise in that way. It also influences weather patterns. It's a climate regulator. And so when you have the water warming, you see other changes in weather patterns, and it also affects things like marine species. Then sea level rise, which we're all very familiar with. There's thermal expansion. There's also the additive quality of water to the oceans as land-based ice melts. Things like extreme rainfall, so changes, maybe not necessarily more rain in a year, but changes in the timing and delivery of the precipitation that we receive in the region, intensified heavy downpours. And then ocean acidification is another one that we like to talk about, at least at the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. These are things like the changes in ocean chemistry due to atmospheric carbon dioxide, and sort of the communication slang is osteoporosis of the sea. Next slide, Kara. So in terms of trying to make all of these different distinctions clear, we have things like impacts, which are the effects or the results of these sort of interactions between a climate phenomena, the related hazards, how vulnerable something might be, and it's the extent to which it's actually exposed to those hazards. So we can think about things like increased heat, drought, and insects all might sort of coalesce together and have an impact on forests and result in increased wildfires. Or we might see additional health impacts and problems because of heat-related illness. Wetter climate means maybe more mosquito-borne illness, or things like coastal flooding when you have sea level rise compound with these extreme wet weather events. So you get coastal flooding and other erosions. Those are all examples of impacts of climate change, which they're not necessarily the climate phenomena themselves or the climate stressor, but it's that interaction. And it's really a lot of what we're interested in. And then this idea of a climate driver. So our behaviors are influencing climate change. So these are drivers or things that factors that change the Earth's radiative balance. So there are natural climate drivers, things like the sun's energy output, regular changes in the Earth's orbital cycle, things like volcanoes. You know, we hear a lot about these natural drivers of climate change, and they're part of the picture. And then we have the human caused drivers of climate change, which includes things like CJ was mentioning in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, or things like changes in land use, which also can change the balance of carbon and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Next slide. So that was just sort of our attempt to set the stage. And now we're going to be talking a little bit about regional trends and projections. And our goal here is to ask you to weigh in. I'm one slide back, Kara. To ask you to weigh in on different indicators. So things that we could measure or look at closely to represent these different stressors, drivers, or impacts. So we'll be asking you to sort of review what we've proposed and provide your suggestions for appropriate data sources that you may be aware of that can contribute to this body of knowledge, other indicators that you might be interested in pursuing and following for regular monitoring in the future. And we're also interested in sort of hearing your feedback on how you would like these indicators to be officially recommended, vetted, selected, and included in this regional action plan. In the past, we've got the Climate Science Advisory Panel that's ready and available to make these kinds of recommendations and have this sort of relationship between the science experts that we have locally in the region and how they interface with the Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition. But we don't want to make that recommendation without your buy-in and your support, and you're telling us that, yes, you would like to use the Climate Science Advisory Panel in that way. So I'm going to turn it over now to Libby to start talking about some examples of climate stressor indicators.
Okay, thank you, Maya. Maya, give a nod if you can hear me all right. Everything sounds good. Okay. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We recognize that your time is very precious and we appreciate you being here with us this morning. This is truly a regional collaborative effort, and without your contribution, we wouldn't have a regional action plan or a regional resiliency coalition. So thank you for being here. I'm representing my role on the Management and Planning Committee, but also I'm here as one of the co-facilitators with Maya of the Climate Science Advisory Panel. So talking about our different terms, just to recall, our observations are going to be the scientifically measured data on the ground that we are recording. So often when I give a climate change overview talk, I kind of realized that most of what I was presenting was actually based on the historic data, which is true observations on the ground. So it's basically indisputable, unless you want to talk about, you know, where a tide gauge is, or if a thermometer is at an airport and has you know, increasing maybe impacts from heat island effects. But overall, we are very trusting in our observations and the peer review process to vet that data. And we'll be talking later about the different local data observations that we have. And then when we talk about projections, we're talking about models. We're talking about inputting historic data, as well as what we know about how the Earth systems work, as well as what we think a climate future might look like in terms of inputting different variables like carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere and so on. And then we get an idea of a projection of what sea level rise or rainfall or future temperatures might look like. Of course, we have a lot of experience with this these days with our coronavirus response. and in terms of whether we're talking about the actual data that have been recorded or future models for potential numbers. And so it's interesting, these some of this terminology is becoming kind of commonplace among our general public, but we're also at the same time, as soon as terms are introduced, they're misused just as quickly. So we need to be really careful with our definitions. Oh, sorry, next slide. I forgot I wasn't in control. Okay, so the Climate Science Advisory, we first formed in 2014, and our first major task was to look at the observed data that we had, as well as the future projections for sea level rise, because we've been recording that in the area for a long time, since the 1940s, with verifiable peer-reviewed data. And we went through a basically year-long iterative review process to look at all the different data sets from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the National Climate Assessment, which is at the national level. We looked at Army Corps data, university data, and projections. And what we decided that we thought was the most suitable data set, or I'm sorry, I should say the most suitable projections to utilize were from the National Climate Assessment, based on the fact that it's mandated by Congress, by the Global Change Research Act of 1980. It is mandated that a climate change report come through every 4 years or so. I apologize, I believe it was 1990. I'd have to double check the date on that.
It's on the
Okay. Sorry. So we and we also recommend that the local tide gauge at the city of St. Petersburg downtown be utilized to ground truth our sea level rise projections for the region, and that can be done using an online tool developed by the Army Corps of Engineers. But we're putting in the National Climate Assessment projections as the output, which we use for the region. So there we have next slide. So there we have a projection that was created locally by a group of regional experts here in the Tampa Bay region, but looking to and kind of in some way vetting the already vetted different scientific reports that are out there and finding the one that is most useful for the region. That's not saying that other reports are wrong. This is just the more appropriate report for our uses in the Tampa Bay region. And so here's, a little review of the National Climate Assessment. So it's mandated by Congress that this report be created every 4 years and be presented to the president and to Congress and summarize what we're seeing on the ground in terms of current and projected future climate change impacts. The fourth National Climate Assessment came out in 1998 in November, and it has a very user-friendly interface online. And so you can access all these different areas that we're talking about. They looked at specific stressors, but they also output regional reports. So we do have a Southeast United States regional report that we can refer to. Okay. Next slide.
Came out in 2018. I don't want everybody to be nervous that it's from 1998. It's just
okay. I apologize. I thought I said 2018. My brain and mouth are not connecting too quickly. So here we have one of the, it's actually one of the figures from the National Climate Assessment. And what we see here is we see different indicators of climate change, and there's an arrow pointing in how they are trending. So we do have the data for these different indicators, and Maya will talk about how we have data sets at the local level and where we're lacking data sets at the local level. So we can see that we know temperature is one that we generally kind of talk about first after we talk about carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. With the greenhouse effect, of course, that's leading to increased temperatures. Increased temperatures lead to increased number of heat waves, or we're also experiencing increased number of heat waves. We are seeing heavy precipitation. We know what we're generally seeing is areas that do get a lot of rain are continuing to get more rain, but it's changing in the way that we experience the rain. So we're seeing more heavy episodic rain events than we are in the past, where we had that same amount of rain spread over more days, more rain events. Of course, we don't really talk about snowpack too much in our region, but it is greatly affecting our neighbors to the north who have less snowpack. And then that does also drive the weather systems that affect our region as well to change. So we are seeing decreased melting Arctic ice, and as well as our growing season lengths. These can be big problems for agriculture, as well as our natural resources, and decreasing heat degrees days, increasing cooling degree days. So okay, make sure that we do stay muted if you're in the audience, and then in terms of drought conditions, that's also kind of an up and down, because our precipitation is kind of the hardest to model, and here in the Southeast United States is a little bit of our question mark. So can we have the next slide? So here we see from the National Climate Assessment different indicators, and we can see the trends that they're taking. So what you can see here is our observed data, or our measurements, are on the left side of these graphs. And then to the right is the projections for the future. So basically, we know that we're looking at a future that looks much different from the past. So we cannot plan as we used to, which we know is why we're all here today. So we could see here, I'm challenging my own eyes, but we could see that we do have increased temperatures trending. Let me get rid of the chat so I can. Anyway, okay. And then we do also see that we have our sea level rise projections on the bottom. We can see a range there in terms of what our projections are. And so those different ranges are associated with different RPCs from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so the highest projection of sea level rise would include the least mitigative action to decrease carbon dioxide emissions, and would also include the highest levels of ice melt, of land ice melt, which is kind of still remains to be one of the bigger question marks that we're not sure of when the ice melt's going to include, how it's going to happen over time. There's a lot of researchers working very hard on that, and the CSAP continues to monitor their work. And then we can see the graph of our sea surface temperatures, which are also trending upwards. And of course, sea surface temperatures are very important for all of our wildlife in the marine oceans, and that are very temperature dependent often. And then we can also see the surface pH, or an indicator of ocean acidification that Maya already mentioned. And that's our data for our bay. Is that correct, Maya, there? In that one that shows our seagrass recovery?
No, these indicators are all they'd be consistent with the CSAP recommendation, because they are pulled from either the IPCC chapters, or the actual chapters from the National Climate Assessment. So these two figures on the right, related to sea surface temperature and surface pH conditions, are from the latest IPCC report on oceans. There was a special report that was released earlier this year. And that's just indicating, trends of sea surface temperatures increasing, and pH, the ocean's getting more acidic.
Okay.
Next slide, Kara.
I was able to fix my slide, so it's not a thumbnail anymore. And then we can see these other observed climate indicators. And so the data that we're collecting on the ground that I mentioned. And so in the upper left, we do have our temperature record from Hillsborough County that we could see is trending upward. In the bottom left, we have our mean sea level rise data collected from the St. Petersburg tide gauge, and then ground truthed and verified by NOAA. In the upper right, we can see the changes in the precipitation events over time. And in the lower right, we are looking at the temperature average, or that's where we're looking at the
Local measurements of pH trends.
yes, local measurements, correct. Yes. So these are the local measurements of pH trends. And what we're seeing here is that the seagrass recovery that the Tampa Bay Estuary Program has been working so hard on for decades with public and private partners has resulted in increased seagrass acreage, which is actually acting somewhat to buffer the ocean acidification occurring in the bay. So it's a very interesting study that they had, and a way that we could see that our local environment, our natural environment actually does help in some ways to buffer against some of these impacts of climate change.
And it's a super example for, an action that someone could pursue to adapt to or mitigate to climate change. And so it's a testament to some of the co-benefits of the activities that are already ongoing in the region. Next slide.
Okay. So talking about what different climate indicators, we're talking about goals. So the data that we want to have and to track and to include in this report. So we've already discussed mean sea level that's recorded at NOAA tide gauges around the country, around the region. In this area, as we said, we generally refer to the St. Petersburg tide gauge, although we do have the Clearwater tide gauge also close by, and re-verifying that data. And for anyone joining us today from Citrus or Hernando counties, our recommendation for those counties is to use the tide gauge from Cedar Key. And we do have an addendum to our recommendation for that. Annual average air temperature being recorded by NOAA around the region. Annual average water temperature. So here we have one of our local entities, the Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County, managing that data set. Our pHs in the Bay and the Gulf are managed also by the Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County, as well as the U.S. Geological Survey. And annual precipitation as being recorded by NOAA. So I believe we wanted to stop here and have a little bit more of a discussion about other climate indicators that are being regionally tracked or recorded, or that you think are important for our region and we have not mentioned or included.
And then just to remind everyone that we'll also be discussing proposed indicators for impacts as well as for drivers. So this is really just to measure the best measurements of climate phenomena that are most important to your decision making in terms of this action plan for climate change.
I am curious why tropical storms and hurricanes have not been mentioned when we see the hurricane frequency, perhaps not affecting Florida as much, but affecting the Gulf Coast. And I'm wondering if that comes later under perhaps impacts, but I haven't seen it yet. And the reason I'm asking the question is because I'm part of the team that's working on Keep Safe Miami. And of course, Miami is in the high velocity hurricane zone of Florida. So it's a bit different from your area, but I'm curious why that has not been even mentioned so far.
David, I think because we are waiting for you to share it and to bring that up. I don't think there's any specific reason that we have not brought it up yet. So I'm trying to think of which section. Hurricane, increased hurricane intensity and frequency, or at least that stronger storms.
I think he gave us the perfect suggestion. We need to include hurricane intensity and frequency somewhere in the assessment, and that's all we need. Are there other ideas?
I would say storms, not just hurricanes, but increased frequency and intensity of storms.
Yeah, so Alan, this indicator that we have listed here is average annual precipitation, in which so I'm glad you said that, because I don't think average annual precipitation is going to get you at get you to measuring that sort of extreme rainfall event. So that's really good feedback.
Yeah, I mean, we got to include not just precipitation, but winds and storm surge.
Yeah, and these lists aren't meant to be exhaustive. They're meant to be sort of, prompts for you all to tell us what you think is most important. And then also realize that there is sort of a bandwidth issue of how many indicators we can track. So we need to understand, which ones are most important. But to get this idea and this feedback from you is that's what we're looking to pull out here.
Gary Mitchum, you have your hand up.
Yes, just 2 points on that same topic. Another thing that's probably going to be important to track in the coming years is not just the number of hurricanes or tropical storms we're having, but we're seeing a trend in the type of storms we're having. Larger, slow-moving, heavy rain-producing storms becoming more common, which increases the flooding risk, not just to the coast, but inland. And so the type of hurricanes that we're seeing is also a very interesting and important thing. And on a related topic, the proposed climate indicator, the annual average precipitation, I think the more important one that Libby talked about a little earlier is the rain rate, the trend in the rain rate itself. The very intense storms that very intense rainfall events that we're getting are flooding risk, like we saw at the Vinoy last year. I think it was last year or the year before. The years have run together lately. So at any rate, the rain rate rather than annual average, I think is more impactful. And the change in the type of hurricanes is probably something that's not quite on everyone's radar yet, but probably the largest impact. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary. That's great feedback.
I think one of the local sources of data that we haven't mentioned yet is Southwest Florida Water Management District. Mm-hmm. They have a very long record of local rainfall, well, groundwater, all of those type of things in their hydrological section. And that's certainly worth looking at for immediate local data.
Yes.
Did you mention stream? Did you just mention stream flow data in what you said? And Maya, I think you said hydrologic data, but that reminds me they did stream flow.
They have stream flow data. Although USGS operates most of the major river gauges, and there's a national river network that provides that data, but certainly the Water Management District keeps track of that type of thing. Yeah, and I think you're quite right about intensity, because not directly connected to hurricanes and those type of rain events, we have major thunderstorm events during the summer that are not related to tropical storms, and they have some massive rainfalls in very, very short amount of time. And I agree that that's something that we could track. The Water Management District, I believe, has access to radar rainfall data. And that might be something, a way of tracking those localized events during the summers.
And I'll also add that Tampa Bay Water is a good source of rainfall and other hydrologic information that they use for their demand management and their source forecasting. So I'm not sure if they're able to have a representative on the call today, but that's another data source that's available to us. And it was actually cited in the National Climate Assessment as one of the models.
Yeah, Maya, can I inject my thoughts on this?
Please do, Marcus.
I don't want to jump the gun maybe a little bit, but this is Marcus with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, by the way. It's good to have obviously discussions of the types of indicators that we want to measure, but when you think about indicators, from my perspective, it's also useful to think about data sources that feed those indicators. And I mean, obviously that's sort of the nexus of this conversation, but I'm hearing thoughts on at least precipitation indicators as one topic here. And, if you identify a data source that is a good, continuous long-term record, either as field data or modeling data, and that is a, sufficient spatial or temporal resolution to cover a really fine scale, that one particular data source could be used as the source for many types of indicators, whether it be sort of a annual assessment of how much rainfall a region is getting, or some of these more nuanced indicators of the frequency of intense storm events. And so I just want to bring that up because as a group, it's useful to think about how one particular data source could serve the needs of multiple different indicators. And, because I know we all have our thoughts on what the best indicators are, but again, my perspective is could be to feed those different types of indicators. And with these continuous records, there's different ways to bin up those sources into various metrics that might quantify different indicators of frequency of storm events, or something on the other end of what is the annual precipitation for a region. So I just wanted to bring that up as something to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because it's sort of, when we went to pull this presentation together, there are so many data sources that we could pull from, for each indicator. There's lots of different options out there. And then when you're balancing that in terms of something that we have the capacity to reproduce and maintain over the long term, it needs to adhere to these kinds of principles that Marcus is talking about. We need to be able to pull it down pretty easily. We need to all agree that these are the right things, if you follow along with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, we're pushing towards open science and fair data principles. And, certainly we would encourage this effort to sort of feather in with that kind of approach as well. It will also make things very much more competitive if we try and go after federal funding, because these are, federal standards for data as well. And I think everyone in the region is pretty interested in trying to have some additional financial support for this kind of work. So. Are there any other thoughts on indicators and data sources for climate change? All right, well, if you have any other thoughts, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm gonna ask Kara to advance to the next slide. Okay, so for all of these indicators for climate that Libby was discussing, some of them she contextualized with these ideas about confidence, likelihood, and she even mentioned the representative concentration pathway. So I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page about what these terms mean as it relates to different climate indicators. So this idea of traceable accounts, or being able to quantify the confidence or likelihood of an event, is a principle that's from a framework that comes from the IPCC and has been incorporated into the National Climate Assessment. And it's basically this review of what we know about the state of data, and then it takes, sort of a clear and defined process and attributes things like a very high confidence level and a very like a good strong likelihood of something occurring. And these kinds of assessments are available for each of the indicators that we've discussed previously, as well as things that are included in the National Climate Assessment. Severity is another thing that we might want to consider when we're thinking about sort of how to contextualize these indicators. But the reality is that this idea about confidence and likelihood is important for framing our decisions about what kinds of climate stressors we're really going to concern ourselves with the most, and we want to prioritize our actions around addressing. Next slide. So a lot of this idea of confidence and likelihood is based on an idea about the representative concentration pathways. And representative concentration pathways is just a fancy way to talk about the way that we connect plausible socioeconomic processes, policy changes, behaviors, those sorts of things, which we know less about, with the expected environmental outcomes based on what we know about the physics of atmospheric science. And really, the physics are pretty well known. There's a few things that we're still learning more about, but in general, the models are pretty good at predicting the environmental response in terms of the atmospherics. The thing that we know less about is really what our human behavior and what our human response is. And so that's what inserts a lot of this uncertainty into these determinations about confidence and likelihood. So So Libby went over some of the things that you maybe are more familiar with in terms of what the Climate Science Advisory Panel recommendation entailed. It packaged a whole bunch of stuff, including what the most appropriate data source for observations about sea level rise is, the most appropriate projections of sea level rise. It included that commitment that CSAP will continue to revisit those projections and that historic data every 5 years at a minimum. But there was also this included in the most recent recommendation from the Climate Science Advisory Panel, a statement that basically we should always assess confidence and likelihood based on this RCP 8.5 scenario until we see behaviors and policy changes being adopted at a widespread scale. And really that's because each of like the curves in the sea level rise projections, they relate to these concentration pathways, which are really tied to these specific behaviors. So you can't just pick that you can't just say, I want to pick the intermediate low curve because that one is palatable to me. You have to know that that intermediate low curve connects to a particular representative concentration pathway, a specific plausible reality that entails strong commitments, not just to adapting to sea level change and climate change, but also to mitigating those effects. And so we say at the Climate Science Advisory Panel that 8.5 is the business as usual curve. It's generally associated with high population growth, less technological innovation, and a higher carbon intensity in the global energy mix. We're hopeful that in our region and elsewhere in the globe, people will make different choices and we can evaluate and assess confidence and likelihood using a different curve. But right now, the curve that we think best aligns with the actual things that are going on the ground is this RCP 8.5 curve. Next slide. So really the RCP, the representative concentration pathways, this is really speaking to this idea of a climate driver. And specifically it's talking about the human, I think we're most interested in these human caused parts of the climate drivers. So that means things like emissions and land use change, as well as our socioeconomic pathways, the extent to which there's widespread support for particular policy actions, how we adapt or mitigate to different climate change impacts that we're seeing, and what kind of governance structure we have. Next slide. So in terms of, I think that we were hearing at some of these initial workshops that there is an interest in also tracking drivers and not just sort of leaving drivers out of the picture. So we're proposing a handful of driver indicators that we might want to track as a region. And so, to sort of throw out some options, some examples for you to consider. One would be something like a greenhouse gas emissions indicator. So right now, the source that I've identified here is there's an annual report that EPA puts out at a national level that might be instructive for us. But I've certainly heard from many of our local partners that they are looking at tracking and doing greenhouse gas inventories locally. So perhaps there's the way that we can sort of do a better job as data stewards in sharing this data, and we could track greenhouse gas emissions at a regional scale. Land cover is another thing we've talked about as a climate driver, and the Southwest Florida Water Management District does maintain land cover data for a 16 county region that would cover everyone that's a part of this climate coalition. Population change has been discussed, and so the Bureau of Economic Business Research puts out projections and estimates of population change that we might be able to pull from, and there might be other local sources that we could consider instead. And then I'm also throwing out there that the Yale Center for Climate Communication does regular polling on attitudes about different climate change beliefs and support for different climate policies, mitigation or adaptation. And that data is scalable down to the county level, so we could collate it in a way that's meaningful to the coalition. These are some examples of indicators that we could pretty easily track and report on to understand what our local contribution is to the different anthropogenic drivers of climate change. But right now I'd like to open it up to see if you all have different ideas of good driver indicators that we might also want to consider.
I would like to comment. I see the land use and land cover change, and that's interesting. I don't know if part of that is buildings, or is that a different driver? Because building energy efficiency, building alternative energy use, in fact, the physical environment of the built environment, in addition to the land use, may be a factor to consider.
That's a good point. And I'd also say that some of the points earlier about transportation, we might want to consider here, although I'm not sure specifically what data sources, I'm not sure what the exact indicator we would want to use is for those things. There you go, daily vehicle miles traveled, there's one.
Maybe that could be a recommendation as a part of an outcome for this, for the next steps would be to define the specific transportation components that fit both in land use and the GHG piece of it. Because roads versus emissions.
Yeah.
As
Yeah,
far
I think
as
as much go ahead.
transportation, I've seen a recent report that was circulated by ICMA on the impacts of electric scooters, and combined, of course, with the reduced driving that's happening with the coronavirus now. They're actually talking about the impact of these individualized transportation systems like these scooters. And they've looked at several cities around the world which have begun to modify their transportation planning in response to that technology. So that may be something for the future at some point.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Thank you. All right, I think, is any last thoughts? If not, throw them in the chat, and then I'm going to toss it over to Chris.
I think I saw Laurie at the bottom there.
Oh,
Hi,
Laurie.
everyone.
You had something to say.
Hi,
Yeah.
everyone. Good to see everyone today on this rainy day. Thanks for the storm, guys. We're up in New York dealing with the remnants of data.
That was Louisiana, not us.
I'm gonna have to think New Orleans. I am thinking about the relationship between what David mentioned of buildings and housing and population change, and where can there be some drivers regarding,
Laurie, can you speak up a little?
Oh, this is better.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I'm thinking about the relationship between, population change and the movement of certain communities away from certain areas of the, of the region. If that's something that, I know it's coming up a lot in our discussions around how our communities are changing and will change. But I do think we should look at maybe development of housing, where it's being developed. I'm not sure what particular statistic we would reference, but I think that it's important to look at our housing and the way things are shifting. Maybe it just ties into David's comment on the building efficiency piece.
I think there's like two things that you're talking about. So the resiliency of the housing stock or the building infrastructure that we have is sort of one question. But then there's this other question, like the New York Times report on how vulnerable properties are already being sort of, they're seeing like that price ding.
Yeah.
And then that kind of ties into these issues about climate gentrification. And
Maya, you got it.
I would agree. Those are really important points. I think the latter points are probably more a good impact indicator to consider. And I suspect that most of our interest lies in impact indicators. And so the tighter we can keep the driver indicators and the climate indicators, I think the better. And then we can really figure out what's important to people in terms of measuring these like more complex things, really.
Thank you, Maya.
That's great feedback. Thank you.
A good source for traffic data would probably be the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the MPO, and also FDOT. Obviously, they keep road counts, specific area road counts, and probably follow general trends as well.
Thank you. All right, let's hand it over to Chris.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Glad to see you're still with us. When I'm looking at the cameras online here, nobody has dozed off with a pleasant breeze. It's probably coming through the window for the first time in forever, not being oppressive down here in the Tampa area. So we are going to enter the short little death by diagram phase of the program. This is here, you know, a bit of a simplistic overview, but kind of summarizing where we started with the different stressors and non-climate stressors, getting into those threats and hazards, be it, you know, the tropical systems and increased tropical systems. And then, you know, kind of back to some of those other earlier discussions, you know, what is the context of those implications from where those all intersect? And getting back to some of the discussions, like, do we have the data to support looking into the weeds with some of these things, or are there different data sets we have to track or figure out a way to get them more granular to support different things? So within the context of this project here, you know, all these discussions we're having on kind of the science and data piece, they're kind of living in this climate indicator stage here. But as we go towards the other chapters of the document, you know, we're seeing where all those items intersect and what impacts they have and what changes we might want to make in data and behavior. And so this is going to kind of circle back a little bit at the end of the process back to our group again, so that we can, you know, once we understand what goals and what things people are really interested in, then we find that right data in the context that was mentioned earlier with, you know, is it spatially good? Is it temporally good? To support any decision making we might want to do. The next slide, please. You know, and so there's different frameworks out there to look at it. You know, some kind of more policy, simplistic overview is looking just, you know, can we deal with the risk and can we transfer it if we can deal with it? And how expensive is it? What risk tolerance do we have for all these things? You know, and they're going to vary by assets and each community's financial and socioeconomic thresholds. So where we probably want to go from here is something on the next slide, which gets to a lot of the discussion we just had. And that's like thinking through this whole process of, you know, what is the influence of a particular driver on the community? And, you know, this is just used, this is us as a company talking to a client, just thinking through, you know, what are some things that heat impacts and which sectors it impacts. And if you follow the ones that have the gray bars as an example underneath them, you know, we're just looking as we go from, you know, heat to transportation impacts. And in this case, we're looking specifically, if you follow the bars, just at commuting, like what is it going to do? Where is it going to increase exposure to heat? What is it going to do to the mode of transportation? You know, at the end there, you start seeing like some of those metrics that we can calculate, looking at the vehicle miles traveled, you guys mentioned, maybe some carbon footprints. And so think through all those things and what ways we can reduce those impacts if we mitigate certain activities. You know, so a lot of this that we want the communities to think through in this process is, you know, what are all those parts in the middle that these climate drivers and stressors and non-stressors are impacting, so that we can decide, you know, and help communities look at what we need to track, and not only what we need to track, but can we get it into a manageable, easily accessible format that communities can use this data to help with their response to climate. Next slide. And so this just kind of gets back to, you know, there are these other chapters of where all these items intersect. And, you know, we wanted to also mention just, and I think Libby brought it up in our internal discussion, you know, there's a lot of indirect things to think about too here. And I believe she was mentioning, you know, more oysters in pipes and, you know, do we have to change materials and lining, and, you know, there's going to be a lot of maintenance costs. And it's not just, you know, necessarily moving a house, but it's, how much more times we have to replace a road or have people out in extreme heat to respond to these things. So we just want to try to help everybody kind of understand where all these factors might live in other chapters, and just let you know that, this is the first piece of the puzzle of identifying, the kind of the data science side of it. And then these future discussions and breakouts that we're going to be having are, how do we help support a data-driven, science-driven approach to any response and policy making? Next slide. So these are some of the proposed indicators here. These are kind of this is the impact indicator. So these are kind of the observable phenomenon that are impacting certain sectors already that are being tracked. And so, we want your input as to, again, this whole process, we're just at the start, and, we'd rather you add a lot of indicators, knowing that we're really maybe only going to be able to manage a certain amount. But, we just want to open this up here for discussion of, these are things that are already out there. Are they going to help us to decide all those goals that we want to get within each community? Are there other impact indicators? And, these indicators, they might, as some people have mentioned in some of the chats on the side, sometimes some of these things that we're tracking, they're both cause and effect of climate. So, just we're open to any suggestions you all have here on what makes sense. And these are just some examples of what we're recommending at this point of things that are already being tracked.
Hi, it's Sean. Just real quick, one thing that popped into my head is flooding. I think is obviously very important, but a lot of times what gets reported is what flooded this year or what flooded this week, which is important. But I think it'd be really interesting to be able to track over time how flooding has changed, and visually for people and graphically. Because when we look at sea level rise graphs and how sea level has changed, and that's one we use all the time for the St. Pete tide gauge, it's very visual, and it'd be interesting to see somehow graphically or in a table or in a graphic over time, like where was flooding in Pinellas County 10 years ago, and where is it now, and where and to continue to track that over time somehow. Just a thought.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with that is that flooding is such a granular phenomenon, and here we're so flat and there's so many dendritic systems that, is the change is it just a pattern change of rain and flooding, or is it that, something that was deferred maintenance has finally been taken care of, or a bridge is now wider and so it's flowing more properly? There's a lot of, potential reasons why those flood areas might have changed. But I agree, it would be kind of interesting to look at.
Gary Mitchum had his hand up.
I just wanted to echo that the high tide flooding is probably one of our largest impacts coming up in the next decade or two when it comes to sea level. So this again is where the largest impact is. We have good projections for this, partly because they don't depend real sensitively on the sea level rise projections over the course of a decade or two. Okay, it's really about the tides, and we can do a very good job with projecting that. And there are very good tools that have been developed. The one that's coming out of NASA now by a former student of mine is starting to be widely adopted. And the second thing is, this is just a pet peeve of mine. I really don't like calling it nuisance flooding. Remember, that was Governor Scott named it that to try to downplay it. It's not a problem, it's just a nuisance. Anyway, high tide flooding is a much better term. Thank you.
I think NOAA refers to it as, on their tools, exceptional tides.
Something, anything like that. Yeah, thank you, but not nuisance.
Yeah, that'd be something that, this is Alan speaking, that'd be something that I'd be interested in knowing how across the region high tide flooding, sunny day flooding is tracked, observed, tracked, reported. We don't see very much up in Pasco County, but We've seen a little bit. So I reached out to some of you guys earlier in the summer. Still don't really know, how much of it occurs across our region.
So Alan, we don't hear you very well. If you can type your chat also, that would be helpful. And I want to throw something out since the scientists are on the phone and I don't get to ask these questions, but is salinity and or water table, because I'm thinking about the agricultural parts of the counties that we have and the need for irrigation, is salinity and saltwater intrusion into any of our freshwater systems a factor?
So saltwater intrusion, not salinity, I think is if you want to know what the freshwater interface is, and the water management district tracks that. It's not like a precise measurement, but it is something we could track how that interface moves over time. They do that as part of the water use caution area.
So what would you call that as an indicator then?
Open the bag.
I'm sorry, there's talking going on.
Open the bag and throw it in the
If everyone else can mute while you're not speaking.
Throw it in the bag garbage.
Was it like Radio Moscow coming through or something here? Maya, what were you saying? What was I asking about? I forgot.
I'm blanking on the actual term, but it's basically that the saltwater freshwater interface of the aquifer, and the water management district tracks that. So we'll record that down there. I don't know if Marcus wants to weigh in on if you were just tracking salinity in like the bay, for example. The salinity trend is one that you might think you might be surprised at just because of these changes in some of the land development patterns and the rainfall that we're seeing. I don't know if I'm putting Marcus on the spot or if he's available yet, but it's just preliminary.
Salinity is tricky. I mean, it's good on the one hand because it's a conservative tracer that is just, it's not consumed by biological organisms. So it's when it's there, but it's also affected by a lot of different things, sea level rise as well as rainfall. And I can speak from the perspective of tracking water quality trends. I mean, it's a surrogate that is it's an indicator of a confounding factor of hydrology on interpreting water quality trends, because we can look at trends in nutrients as a measure of eutrophication, but those nutrients are going to be largely affected by inflows into the system. And so if you're looking at either a management response of point source controls or stormwater controls, that is a very tricky thing to look at, because you've got to consider that confounding factor of inflows and salinity as a surrogate for that. But I'll also say as a whole, when we look at the long-term record of salinity in the bay, I mean, there's been marked changes of increases in salinity over the last 10, 20 years. That is a concern from just how the system is responding to changes in flow and hydrology. So there's a lot of things wrapped up in salinity, and there's a lot to say about our interpretations of water quality in response to that. But it's definitely something I don't want to discount as a very useful indicator and a very useful long-term record that we have to sort of track those changes from multiple factors.
Yeah, and to the confounding things to consider, for the freshwater saltwater aquifer interface, you also have this consumptive use. So consumptive use is affecting what's going on in the groundwater as well as what's going on in our surface waters, because we have diversified water supply sources. So the Hillsborough River has a minimum flow established because significant harm was occurring. The Tampa Bypass Canal has a minimum flow of 0. So that freshwater flow into the upper portions of the bay, isn't there. We had lots of, areas in Pasco County and Hillsborough County that were affected by groundwater withdrawals, and all of that sort of changes how much saltwater intrudes. So you have, again, sort of these dual pressures that are coming from both places. So it's important to tease that out and make sure that we're clear about what phenomena we're trying to describe.
I think those are great points, and the key gets to the compound effects on local agriculture, local aquaculture, local recreation habitats, and all of that. So however y'all scientists can do that magic of this is important because it's going to impact, going back to Chris's phenomenal slide, this one thing goes here and here and here and here, right? And the consumption component also is a factor, because that gets then tied back to population growth, housing, water management, all the building sides of it, and efficiencies.
And maybe just, I know there's a couple people on the phone too, and I don't think I read off the things on the slide here. So maybe just to help if you were on the phone. So the proposed impact indicators were high tide flooding, which is available through NOAA, vector-borne illness, which is through the CDC, habitat migration, which the estuary program is tracking, heat-related illness, which the CDC has information on, harmful algal blooms, which, you know, is caught big impact last year that opened a lot of people's eyes. And then the change in growing season length that the EPA is monitoring. So just in case those people on the phone weren't sure, I didn't want to read the slide to them, but this might help them.
Great, a lot of good comments coming in about public health, different types of mechanisms, data components that could be monitored. We've been compiling lists of climate, health, equity, and frameworks that will be communicated more at the next workshop. But I've started to just become more aware of the tremendous work that's being done to look at these ongoing aspects of heat and stress on community and health as a population. So I think how we define heat-related illnesses is going to be an interesting subcategory under indicators. Combination of heat plus humidity on asthma and COPD. So we're so glad that, I feel like I just like Kayla Murphy and Daphne and Cassidy are like the new rock stars of climate health and helping us learn about these health impacts. So sorry, I digressed to the new thing I'm focused on, heat. Sorry.
Well, we're chewing into your break time now. So, if there's any last thoughts, maybe get them in the chat, and let's turn it back over to Kara for next.
Yeah, so the break is until 10:30, and then we'll come back and do some breakout discussions, and I'll give you the instructions when you come back. But you're free to stretch your legs and grab a bite to eat if you need to, and please, we'll resume at 10:30. Okay, well, now that everyone's back, if anyone would like to report out on any changes they made to the goal language, which was the first sort of discussion question. Or
I'll kick it off. So it's Hank Hottie. So we're in group 3, and we weren't sure about having the word improve to start it off, because we would like to think that we're already doing well, right? And there's somewhat of a negative connotation there. And so we didn't suggest a different word, but we thought that it might be good to have something a little more reflective of what we're already doing, and acknowledging that that there are actions to be had moving forward. So we thought that, and then also to include impact along with indicators, so climate indicator and impact data.
Thanks,
Nice. This is Maya from group 5. To echo Hank's first point, we thought that the language should encourage the use of existing monitoring data where possible.
That's good. I was in group 2 with Chris and David and Darcy, and we had some questions about the phrase on collaboration. So we tried to hone in on more specific aspects of it. There's a lot of existing data that was out there. So there was some clarification on that. And then Darcy or Chris, anybody want to comment about the second goal that was in there really?
I think the biggest thing with goal 2 is we just wanted to, it seemed like am I muted? No, sorry. I was getting some feedback. that the use of climate change for decision support is probably, one goal by itself, and then how we do a regional approach to risk communication is probably a separate goal. And then we could, tailor objectives specific to risk communication or the decision support processes of climate change.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, this is Maria for Group 4. I don't know that we really have anything more specific to add to that, except we had a discussion around if there was additional local data that needed to be collected. So for instance, I just, referenced using is public health data around like heat effects really available in a regional way, and to make sure it's being collected if we're going to have a regional report card at the end, to make sure that we're coordinating how that's regionally collected so that we're not comparing apples to oranges. But I think that might be more in goal 2. I might have gotten ahead of myself.
No, thank you for the input. And if anybody wants to talk about what they did with the objectives.
Hey, this is Alan in the A group, which was group 1. A group because it was Alana and Alan. Under objectives, one of the things we said is to increase the accessibility of data. It would be great if there was a way for the RPC to make the appropriate data accessible. Provide us with links or something so that we know which data we should be using. I don't know that there's anything like that on the RPC website, but I'm constantly looking for where to find data. Mm-hmm. If you could point us in the right direction, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good objective.
I'll just, Maya from Group 5, reiterate that point that also came up in our group. And so we talked about the need to have some sort of open science principles or a data repository where the best information is available, everyone can access it and contribute to it as need be.
Thank you.
Nice. Yeah, the ability to link out to key data sets that are updated and managed and owned by other people, but from a common site, and that's a great idea. Data repository.
Yeah, this is Maria from Group 4 again. I was in with John, Mary, and Marcus, so I just want to ask them if they want to weigh in at all. But one of the things we talked about is maybe having data around ecosystem services as that modeling starts to grow. That will help better balance the competing interests of human population growth and conservation of natural resources that might help buffer climate change effects. So we just listed some of those ideas out in the plan objectives, but it may come under some more cohesive thing. But if there's data on ecosystem services, whether that would be relevant.
One of the things we talked about in our group was the challenge of some of these like more nuanced data collections, like about mental health or ecosystem services, how they tend to be one-off or not very regularly repeatable kinds of assessments, and how we had expressed in our group a desire for the data that we're using for indicators to be things that are part of like long-term ongoing monitoring that are, again, easy to pull from, that maybe could be informative for some of these more complex one-off studies that we can use, but maybe aren't the right thing for an indicator. Not saying it's no, but that was some of our discussion.
Both good ideas, good input there. Figuring these levels of data integration out is going to be an important sub-action maybe to define. When we say data, this is the quality, this is the standards of the data. So how long does a thing need to be a time series of, right? what level of granularity, not to be specific in that, but if this is, there's the use of additional indicators and then there's the indicators themselves, right? So there's different ways of looking at it. But.
Yeah, this is Chris in group 2. I think we also had in here, like as an objective, maybe defining or providing some guidance on how those indicators can be utilized by different entities to understand those impacts. Because I didn't know like how we're going to apply pH to some particular mechanism. I mean, that obviously sounds like something environmental, but maybe it's got other consequences or actions that need to be understood.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It has economic consequences for stone crabs and calcifying organisms, aquaculture.
Osteoporosis.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why we were like, the link between the data and the indicators is important, because like, why does this matter to us, right? What level of planning or impact to people, place, or prosperity, I guess.
One way to say it is to provide us with some best practices for using the data.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on CJ's comment, and I think what everyone else is sort of echoing here. I mean, conversations around best practices for data management, QA, QC, metadata standards, data dictionaries, all that fun stuff is an inherent challenge anytime you work with data, obviously. But for this group, you know, I know this broader conversation today is about what do we even think about using as indicators, but this brings in other conversations about how we handle the data. And the sooner that conversation happens around best practices of data standards, the easier it will be on the back end for working with this information to actually make decisions. So I would just encourage us as a group, you know, if we want to get serious about this and actually think about using these data, we need to have a conversation sooner rather than later about best practices for handling data, because I've seen this time and time again. You know, it's sort of a form of damage control after the fact when you have all these great ideas about working with data, but nobody's really had that hard conversation about best practices, and it just, you just mop up afterwards when you're done. So just my 2 cents on that.
Okay, captured it in the chat.
And this is Hank, group 3. I think on the more front end, simpler aspect of that is an objective we talked about for goal 1 is more localized collaboration and synergies of monitoring programs. So, how can this plan enable new partnerships and collaborations to collect data, across different jurisdictions, different departments, combining budgets, things like that. And so I think that's an opportunity here as well. If we don't have the data, let's go get it. Or if this jurisdiction does it one way and we do it another, let's figure out a unified approach with the goal of this plan in mind. So
yeah, and that came up in group 5 too. Natasha made a lot of these points. There's another data-minded group called the RRAP that Rob Brown helped start to form, and Natasha facilitates now, that maybe should be pulled in somehow. And then some of our conversations about, there's a data infrastructure that Marcus was kind of referring to that we've got in place for the Bay, but we acknowledge that this effort for climate needs to be broader. It needs to incorporate, elements of Gulf trends and intercoastal waterway trends. And we know that our partners are collecting these data now. And so we can sort of take some of the data wrangling stuff that we have in place and maybe pull in these other data sources, which are already, made comparable by efforts like RRAP, and use that for some of this infrastructure that we're talking about putting together for this action plan.
So I'm going to echo, that's fantastic. I just tried to write some random words. Hopefully that captured what you meant, but it's a catalyst for later. There are really strong GIS work groups that are around the region now that they should be a part of that piece of it. So RRAP plus, I know, from Manatee County, they're multidisciplinary. There are multiple agencies and local governments and nonprofits working on that. So that may be a, mostly they're sharing info at this point. Sorry. Go
I'll
ahead.
put a plug in there for my colleague Marcus. He's got an open science subcommittee as well. So it's another one of these data infrastructure, data sharing kind of groups, really focus on all of these things. And, you know, I think most of you don't know him yet. So I guess I'm trying to like introduce him too and tap you into him as a resource. He's a data scientist. He's got really great skills. He's a total asset to our region. And if you're interested in a lot of these concepts, you know, using the Open Science Subcommittee is another thing I'd recommend.
Okay, I just read, define all of the local entities working on data science and applications, because clearly we just hit a big thing that they're out there, they're not talking to us right now, but you know them. So building that into the goal of this and bringing these folks to a bit of it would be phenomenal. I think I proposed a GIS working group early on and everybody just looked at me like I was smoking something really bad. Because I was like the king, you know, out of the College of Marine Science, it was clear the inconsistencies of data that's produced, the use of it, and then, you know, gobs of good data that go unused because they don't get communicated or get to the right people for applied use or interpretation. So there's a whole set of problems with different aspects of data creation and wrangling, as you said. So. All right, now we've gotten into this super geek weeds. Good ideas, folks. This is what I was excited. I was really thinking that there could be some really big ideas on, you know, indicators and data coming out of this piece. So.
Okay, so just in the interest of time, if you guys want to go back and work on the action some more, you have time to do that. We also have one last discussion question in that Google Sheet related to whether or not a scorecard makes sense for this chapter. And if you have any things that you would want to see in that scorecard, feel free to put that under that discussion question 4. The rooms are going to be the same rooms and you'll still be working in the Google Sheet. And then I'll be pulling you back at 11:50.
Thanks, Karis. So I want to say,
Hank, if you had a question.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to, I don't want to get us off track, but I don't feel like we talked about goal two enough. And I don't know if any other groups, there's 2 parts in that. One, we thought it needed to be a little stronger than encourage. So to support or provide or apply regional consistency. And then towards the end, it talked about consistent decision support. I felt like that was, I was waiting for the of what. And so, or we were, so I don't know if anyone else had, you know, before we get into actions, I just want to make sure that that was touched on. I mean, we talked about splitting that goal apart, but is there a way to make that stronger and a little bit more precise?
Or more aspirational. Decision support for effective mitigation and adaptation investment and to support a beautiful economy and a global whatever. I mean, so the question is, what do you think it could or should be?
Okay.
Right. So if it's unclear and fuzzy, just hack it up.
So hi.
Hi.
We kind of had a little education within our group about the relationship between the CSAP and the coalition. And one of the things that we kind of clarified and got an understanding about is the role of the CSAP. And that might be already existing vehicle to help kind of answer that question for goal 2. So just wanted to throw that out there because we did discuss that in our group and I got an education, so.
Good. CSAP is important and has been super, super useful. So Mary Helen just posted a thing before we head out. What about discussion of other goals that need to be added? I think certainly if you feel that there are things that should be other goals and relating to this, we want you to go ahead and post them and add them and talk about why this fits with other things. And, you know,
yeah, there's some lines there for adding additional goals if you have some that you want to suggest in the spreadsheet.
Yeah, and I think in our group, relative to that goal 2, one of the things we had was maybe just, and I don't know, maybe it's CSAP or maybe it's this data committee, whatever gets started, but it's maybe defining which ones that approach really is relevant to. Like, you know, from a decision support perspective, maybe there are some things that make sense to be done with a very consistent regional approach, and other things might need to be very specific to an asset or a community's risk tolerance. So maybe we just kind of, you know, provide guidance as to which ones make sense to have that regional approach and which ones should be done at a more local level.
And I wanted to touch on that scorecard concept because some questions came up in our session. I think it's a positive connotation. What does success look like in 5 years? If we set these goals, how will we know if anyone has done anything? What is the 3 or 1 or things that we as individual local governments and or the region are going to say, okay, yeah, we all agree to now track heat or whatever it is, right? So the key is it can be a broad piece of a goal or it can be more defined, but it is a possibly a numeric setting. It's not or it's, you know, something. How will we know if we've actually made some progress in 5 years or 2 years? And what is it that you think should be measured if you're local government, or you think the region should measure collectively? And that those are the kinds of inputs that we would be looking to identify that can actually help then inform the goals better themselves potentially. So.
Oh, I don't want to further this discussion if we need to go to the breakout room, but one good point that I thought was really interesting that was raised about scorecards in our group was how they're used to display either failures or successes, and how those two things can lead to potential criticisms or praise, depending on who's responsible for tracking progress or managing towards a particular goal. I have my opinions about it, but I just wanted to sort of put that out there for us to maybe think about as what is the purpose of a scorecard in terms of the implications for who's responsible for maybe dictating what is put on that scorecard.
Right. Well, that's where all of these are great points, and it is scoring is very delicate, and it is absolutely regional consensus driven. Okay, so we can make 100 things to be scored, and then everyone will weigh in and vote, and it'll get mitigated and mediated, and turn out to be something that everyone can agree to. So that's really what we're going to look at is. It ideally has some specific elements that can point to onward progress locally. Or if it is a regional ask, like get money to get better public health data, or get a grant and everyone start tracking this, whatever, right? Or go to DEP. I don't know, whatever the goal is we want to propose, but it can be a range of things.
Okay,
so.
I'm gonna move to the breakout room.
Okay, we'll see you there.
We'll pop back in at 11:50. Okay, I'm sorry for the abrupt end to the breakout discussions. Does anybody want to talk about the scorecard briefly and what their thoughts were on the usefulness of a scorecard for this chapter?
This is Maria from Group 4. I think Marcus sort of brought it up on the last conversation. I think we got a little confused about and started talking about 3 and 4 in the first breakout room, but I just want to emphasize that. So I think a couple of us thought the scorecards were a good idea, and then people from the municipalities, Mary particularly spoke to being careful about how we be sensitive, as CJ said, be sensitive to what kind of indicators we use. Because when the data gets misused by the media, it becomes hard on some of the municipalities. So I think, again, just overall, it can be a good communications tool, but to be sensitive about what actually things you use to measure it. Did I capture that right, Group 4?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and what CJ was saying earlier about consensus-driven decisions on what a report card should display is really the main point I just wanted to be made about that. I mean, there's going to be trade-offs from different parties based on interests, and collectively as a group, if people can come to a consensus about what a report card should show, that's exactly what should be done. And just another kind of plug for the estuary program here. I mean, we have a nitrogen management consortium where we have just that. We have a report card that shows how well or whether or not the goals are being met for a particular part of the bay. And there's certainly groups in there that you know, depending on how good or how well or bad they're doing, they're going to be, you know, on the line for potentially mitigating that issue. But they've come to that group and they're in the same room. They've agreed that this is the consensus on what we should be reporting on and what action should be taken as a result of that. So I just wanted to bring that point up.
This is Hank in group 3, and we unfortunately didn't get to this. We were talking about actions, and I do have a suggestion that would go into the scorecard. But one thing that I would suggest and advise is that we word this so it's more of a collective scorecard. I mean, rather than, you know, when this says track local progress, I know that's not what the scorecard is going to be, but I think, you know, pinning it on the individual, you know, jurisdictions or organizations may not be the right political pathway for this. And so I think if it's more of a collective scorecard, maybe that's what we are talking about, where we're talking about the indicators, where we're talking about the impacts, and like, hey, we're not doing a good enough job collectively as part of the coalition, as part of this plan on this issue. I think that would resonate better around. That said, to get to action, to get to implementation, so we can track a scorecard or have a scorecard. Something I wanted to bring up is, and CJ, I'll let you think on this and muddle on it, but we don't know if there's a way to create an additional vehicle of process structure and buy-in for the actions on these goals. And I don't know if it's a, you know, new MOU or an addendum or a charter or something like that. But, you know, once we set these goals and have these objectives and actions, I don't think we should just have the assumption that everyone who signed the original MOU is going to uphold it. So I know that opens up a can of worms, but I think that's something that we need to think about. And so, you know, as an action, we wrote that in, and I think that would help with measuring success if there's accountability and further accountability and buy-in moving forward.
Thanks, Hank. That's a good summary. That's a big thought process that Karen and I have been, you know, trying to get these things to the point where we could have those conversations and meetings, you know, co-presentations to the BOCC at some point once all of y'all have honed in on this, and while we go, said that they know what we're working on and local governments. So it's going to take some time, and I think that'll look slightly different at each local government, right? But, and so that's the point of what are the goals that we know we can make progress on, but not to lowball it so much.
So this is Alan. I was in group 1. I kind of agree with what Mary put into the chat, that scorecards should be success driven. But I want to argue the counterpoint that I would like to see local governments compared, not necessarily to be held accountable, not to, you know, shame anybody, but I just think it's valuable. Kind of the point that, well, I don't know if it was Marcus, the point that was made about the nitrogen management coalition. Don't tell anybody I said this, but I kind of would like to see, you know, how we rank, and I think it's useful. And with regards to actions, yeah, Hank, I agree. But also, I think we need, as local government, you know, as someone who is constantly working with functional units like the stormwater engineers and the transportation engineers and other design, you know, folks doing design projects and whatnot for our county government. I need help to kind of point out to my teams how to use this data. So if we could engage and encourage some either universities or organizations to help us with a little bit of education and training about, you know, how is Hillsborough County and Pinellas County using data? Right now, the only way for me to find that out is to just get on the phone and start cold calling people. Hey, what are you guys doing? How are you guys doing this stuff? So if there's anything that the coalition can do to help that would be good.
I agree. I think we talked a little bit about that in our group, but the importance of what's the data for, how to use it, and that, like many of you with the overall goals in your comp plan, there's probably a set of separate documents that need to be produced, similar to what CSAP did with the sea level rise report, that would reflect on this sort of standardized indicators or whatever. Could be ideas.
CJ? Hi,
Bill?
this is Bill O'Dell with the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies. I apologize. I lost power in the middle of what up until then had an incredibly informative and productive session this morning. But I did want to make one point about the previous comment. Well, I know this is difficult for local governments to consider under the circumstances, but I continued to wonder throughout the presentations about administrative capacity. I don't mean that critically. I mean, there have got to be holes that y'all need to fill. And I'll just naively say this. It seems like, for example, maybe you need more hydrologists on staff. And it seems to me that one of the things that this regional group could do is begin to point out where you need to add administrative capacity to deal with the complexity of this issue. And the enormous interdependence across all of this information, all of these models, all of the emerging impacts. So, and of course, we stand ready to help on the housing side.
Phil, that's a great point. The aspect of scientific and technical capacity, how you define that relating to whether it's the science side, using the data or getting new data, and then this could also fit into chapter 3 in terms of community and local government capacity and competence building. So thank you for bringing that up.
Hi there. So I just wanted to make a point for this chapter. Our group had concerns about using scorecards in this regard, and basically just kind of being supported by like sensitivity being needed and stuff. We considered how maybe prioritization would be a better process, simply because, the reality is, there are aspects or indicators that are important, but maybe they're not yet consistent, developed, or funded effectively or enough to be able to use in something like this if we're looking for long-term goals. So, having a prioritization can help lead, entities to start someplace, but not discredit or, kind of say, oh, they're not performing if they choose to do a priority that's more, relevant to their circumstances, if that makes sense. So that's something that we talked about at great length in our group.
I just threw it up there in a broad sense of the concept.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna just briefly wrap up and then you guys are welcome to go to lunch. But just as a reminder, this isn't the last time we'll talk about this chapter. This chapter is gonna be built on in the chapters 2 through 5. We anticipate that there's going to be additional data needs that we identify as we go through those chapters. And so we'll continue to sort of keep a list of all of the data needs that come up throughout that process. And then we'll re-engage this group to sort of finalize and write goals and integrate the stuff that we've heard in chapters 2 through 5 into the first chapter. So that's what we're talking about here. And then just as an update, sorry, it looks like that got cut off at the bottom, but moving forward, we have set up the landing page for the Resiliency Action Plan. So if you want to see the future meeting dates, so we're going to keep updating that. Try to update that with meeting materials after the meetings are completed. So if you want to see meeting materials for the table of contents meetings that happened at the beginning of this month, those are up there at tbrpc.org/resiliency plan. The next workshop date is next week, November 5th, and that's going to be from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. And that's the sort of Chapter 2, Socioeconomic Demographics and Community Vulnerability. And then we'll continue to update the workshop dates on the website and send out emails. There are some dates listed on the website, but we might have to adjust those based on people's availability. We want to make sure that the people who want to attend the meetings are able to attend those meetings. CJ, do you want to say anything about the meeting next week?
We're going to get much more into the current conditions of our resident populations. So community as it stands today, climate and health and future community components. Housing is a piece of this one as well, sort of establishing the risks and how that also connects to health and well-being, and that'll set some things. So again, we'll have a lot of goals for that. We're looking forward to presentations from Florida Housing United Way, the Health and All Policies people, as well as information from Schimberg Center. I just wanted to say to Maya and to Kara and to Chris, and Libby's gone, but thank you. You guys did a great job. The science it's complicated, and I thought your ability, the way you brought this into a set of categories and terms is really helpful and important way to start the rollout of the actions and where we go from here. So thank you for all the difficult work that you have been doing on these things for the years to get to this point. It's just make it look easy. Thank you. You're like, oh, crazy. So, all right, y'all, thanks for your participation today, and keep sending Kara and I notes. Kara, thank you for a very well organized meeting. Lots of good stuff.